guest, Michael Fabricant, Conservative MP for Lichfield and friend of the show. Michael, first of all, you've known Nadhim Zahawi for well over a decade. You've been colleagues on those green benches. How have you reacted to the last week, this sort of media storm and then this really quite quick conclusion?
Well, very mixed reactions. I mean, firstly, I used to be in business before I was a Member of Parliament. I remember in my own business, we had an HMRC investigation. Actually, it turned out that they owed us money, but it took them a week of several accountants being in our offices to work that out. And, you know, paying a penalty is not that unusual when you're in dispute with HMRC. And YouGov, as you know, is a very big corporation with offices in the United Kingdom, America, and other countries. So I was sympathetic. But, you know, it was becoming a distraction. And while a distraction, a political distraction, has got nothing to do with justice, I think that the Prime Minister, and I very rarely agree, actually, with our front bench on most things, but on this thing, I think Helen Waitley and the Prime Minister was right. He was right to wait until an inquiry had gone in, and you outlined extremely well where the difficulties were. Yes, Nadhim Zahawi did tell the civil servants that there was a dispute going on, but it should have been in writing. You have to do things properly. But I can tell you, as a former minister, that the ministerial code is quite complicated, so people do make mistakes. But I think Rishi was absolutely right to wait, and I think was absolutely right to make the decision that he did.
It is interesting to read the Sir Laurie Magnus report, which doesn't really criticise Nadhim Zahawi for the fact that he was investigated by HMRC, for the fact that he paid a penalty. It criticises him on multiple occasions for not disclosing it when it happened. Now, as you say, you have been investigated, or your business was. You came out smelling of roses, but to what extent should Nadhim Zahawi have just been open and honest throughout this process? Might he still be the chairman of the Conservative Party if he had been?
Yes, absolutely right. And, you know, I remember when I first became an MP, all those years ago, someone said to me, a very old grand character, and he said, you know, you can murder your wife, Michael, not that I'm married, but you could murder your wife, Michael, as long as you're open with the House of Commons and declare it. And if necessary, apologise to the whole House. And I think that was a slight exaggeration, yes. Right. But openness is the key word, and he wasn't open.
It's the classic line from Watergate, I believe it first came up. It's not the crime, it's the cover-up that
exactly
really gets
right.
you. Yeah. So wider context now. Obviously, the Conservative Party is still 20 points behind in the polls, in some polls closer to 30 points behind. It's the most extraordinary situation, and I don't think many of your colleagues perhaps assumed that that your party would still be this far behind after getting in Rishi Sunak. Wasn't he supposed to fix everything?
Well, I think a lot of colleagues might well be now regretting the action they took against Boris Johnson. And the situation with Rishi is an interesting one. You know, the membership of the Conservative Party, the ones who get out there and do the campaigning, voted 2-1 for Liz Truss. And not for Rishi. Well, we all know what happened with Liz Truss, and Rishi is now our Prime Minister. I mean, there's no hunger for change. But nevertheless, I mean, there will be growing concerns, particularly if we do badly in the local elections in May. But what happens then, I don't know. I mean, listen, nobody likes defenestrations. I mean, the party became unpopular because of what happened to Boris. We could become even more unpopular if anything were to happen to Rishi. So I think the general view at the moment, certainly my view at the moment, is just let Rishi get on with the job.
And yet, in your view, the May elections might be some sort of time to reassess where the party is. If the party does very, very badly in the May elections, can you see a route for perhaps, maybe not a leadership contest, but maybe resetting the dial to perhaps where things were before the summer?
Well, members of Parliament want to remain members of Parliament, and when they feel their positions threatened because of unpopular leadership, they sometimes take action. Now, we had too much action, I would argue, in 2022. Whether there'll be more action in 2023, we shall see. But this is where the pressure lies on Jeremy Hunt. Jeremy will be appearing before the 1922 committee tomorrow. and talking to us about the budget, which is on March the 15th, before the local elections. Now, if Jeremy is ultra cautious and doesn't give some tax breaks, doesn't give some red meat, and just continues with an attitude that, well, things have got to remain as they are, then I think we will do badly in the local elections. And I think Jeremy Hunt will have some questions to answer.
That's a really stark assessment. Jeremy Hunt appearing before you all tomorrow in private, behind closed doors. What do you assess your colleagues are going to be saying to him out of the gaze of the view of the media?
Well, I think they'll be asking for some personal tax cuts. Now, it could be that Jeremy is simply arguing that, you know, he's not going to give away the budget. He can't do that. But he's been sort of laying the groundwork that there aren't going to be changes. What was it he said over the weekend? The biggest tax cut will be my lowering inflation. But we know that inflation is reducing because price rises are not going up further. So consequently, 1 year after the following year, the way you measure inflation, it will go down by a half by the end of the year. I think colleagues will say, that's not enough, Jeremy. You've got to give us something more.
And just very finally, we're running close on time, but if Jeremy Hunt doesn't offer you what you're asking, if those local elections go badly, might Boris Johnson potentially be seen on the horizon as that man to maybe dig the party out of where it is?
Well, firstly, Boris has got to get through his investigation in Parliament. If he gets through that, well, you know what Boris is like. He could be back in the game. Anything could happen.
Back in the game. Well, Michael Fabricant, thank you so much for joining us this morning on The Briefing. Always a pleasure to have you here and to go through those really seismic issues.